The truth in all of the isms. Okay, so before I get accused of being a postmodernist, which I'm not, I'd like to explain the goal of this video. What I'm going to be doing in this video is I'm going to be taking a bunch of isms and I'm going to attempt to sort of extract the truth from within these different isms. And the goal of this is to exemplify the following point. Truth, as we know it, or often don't know it, is infinite and rich, and as such, it cannot be attained or exhausted in one particular ism. And so the sort of dogmatic view that there is one ism that can kind of hold the entirety of truth is false. Now this may sound like a sort of pluralistic, relativist, postmodernist view. It's not, because the goal is not to say that all isms are equally valid or true or legitimate, but rather to say that it is our job in our quest for truth to find a larger truth paradigm that can sort of encompass the truth within the ostensibly rival isms. And so that's the goal of this video. All right, so I'm going to begin with the first ism. Hegelianism. Hegelianism. I can't say it. Okay, you know, Hegel. So the philosopher. The idea is, well, he says a lot of things. One thing I think I agree with him is his view of the collective as its own sort of entity rather than a sum of its parts. Yeah. Where Hegel goes wrong is he jumps from that to like worshipping the state, and it's like, no to worshipping the state, but yes, the collective has its own intrinsic value. Objectivism. Ayn Rand's books were probably the only books I've ever read that made me like physically nauseous. A friend of mine calls objectivism ideological selfishness. I think that's a good way to put it. I mean, I guess the core truth in it is sort of similar to capitalism. So there's like, it puts like, it's true that there's like a legitimacy for the individual to like fulfill his own desires. I don't know. Nihilism. Ooh, okay. So nihilism is basically life is meaningless, right? So I would say there's truth to that in like a different time frame. And that is to say that I think that in an ideal reality, when life is like super perfect, like perfect, that kind of reality would sort of justify itself. And so people would probably not feel a need to look for meaning that is like out there, like beyond. The desire for meaning would probably diminish, not because meaning doesn't exist, but rather because it's just going to be like inherent in life. I find a lot of isms are like that. A lot of utopian ideologies are like that. It's just like, if you take them and you just put them in another time frame, they actually work, but like now it doesn't work. Nihilism right now is bad because it's like depressing and stuff, and also like, I mean, it's life negating, and yeah, so not good. But I would save it for the future, you know, maybe like in some ideal future I would join the nihilists one day. Egalitarianism. Okay, so I think this one is pretty easy to point to the truth aspect of it, and that is that there is a fundamental equality between people in that we were all made in God's image or have a soul. Egalitarianism is a problem when we assume that there are no distinctions between people, and it basically ignores all differences between people. So monotheism is an ism that people relate often to Jews because there is a false assumption, or it's not really an assumption, it's just like one of those common knowledge that are just wrong. And that is that Jews are monotheistic, and that's not true. Jews are actually not monotheistic because monotheism is basically trying to negate plurality, like numerically. And the Jewish conception is that God is beyond definitions, and categorizations and numbers would be included in that. So that's not exactly what Jews mean when they say God is one. Rather, the idea is that there is like a fundamental unity between all of existence. That's the idea of like the oneness of God. And in that respect, I would say monotheism is true in the sense that there is a fundamental unity between all things. Atheism. So atheists are correct in that there is no magical supernatural being in the sky. There is no supernatural being. But yeah. Atheists are also correct about most of their criticisms of religions, such as religions being opium to the masses, or religions playing into the deceptive psychological fears and complexes of human beings, and God being, like, belief in God being a sort of concept that's open to exploitation. And yeah, most of their criticisms are true, and I'm not even an atheist. Capitalism. The truth in capitalism is that, I'm not sure about this one. I think like there's a fundamental idea that capitalism is built on like an attempt to make man like self-made and like responsible for his destiny, and like the self is sort of central. I don't know how much that actually works. Like, on the other hand, we have imperialist wars, indigenous exterminations, and basically like essentially modern feudalism, being enslaved to our bosses. Nationalism. Okay, so nationalism is true in that people really are tribal. There's sort of like, it's sort of like an extended egoism, like I love myself and this is my nation, so I love my nation like more than other nations. So that's kind of like, it's a natural thing. So in that respect, it's true. And I also think it's sort of a necessary step towards like a higher universalism. Problem is it could lead to fascism and, you know, hatred of other nationalities. Universalism is true in that people do share many common values, that some, at least, differences between people are socially constructed. And yeah, universalism is a problem when it basically forces some kind of like surface level multiculturalism that again does not distinguish between differences between people. It does not recognize those differences, and it just attempts to demolish them. And it's basically a sort of, it creates like strangely like a sort of imperialism, because it's like forcing one like multicultural identity on everyone. So yeah. Okay, reductionism is when you take a phenomena and you try to reduce it down to its principles and sort of individual parts in order to figure it out. And this is true in the sense that often things will be made up from parts, and dismantling them and breaking them up, reducing them into their core principles is a good way of figuring a lot of things out. Problem with reductionism is that it's making a false assumption that all things are reducible, whereas phenomena is sometimes a sort of synthesis of the individual parts that made up that phenomena. So in that case, it has like new properties, it's its own like unique entity. It's not necessarily reducible, and then you cannot apply reductionism. I guess Hegel's idea of the collective could be an example of that. Like, I don't think you can apply reductionism to Hegel's conception of the collective. Empiricism. Okay, empiricism is true in the sense that most information we get, or a large portion of it, is through our senses, and that scientific methods and experimentation and evidence are really good ways to figure things out and know systems and stuff. Problem with empiricism is that it denies an entire other channel of knowledge that exists within the human being, and that's like the more mythological, primordial, intuitive side. And Yeah, I'm actually reading Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning right now, and he's actually talking about this, about how there's like these like two realms. There's like the empirical and there's the mythological, and both are ways to know the world, like to actually know it. And if you ignore one, you are not knowing everything. But empiricists don't like that because they don't feel safe within things that are not measurable, and so they deny that part. Pantheism. All right, so the idea that nature is God, basically. So that's kind of a strange idea, I would say, Mr. Spinoza. I would say nature and reality are an expression or manifestation of divinity, but yeah, I wouldn't say that nature is God, even though Spinoza had a sort of his own understanding of what that means, but nonetheless, it's kind of odd. Absurdism. Yes, Camus, we were thrown into this world with no explanation. It's a tough truth to accept. Problem with absurdism is that, I guess, the myth of Sisyphus, it kind of creates like a search for something that you cannot attain, and therefore it's kind of absurd. So there's like, just the whole thing is absurd. Although what's interesting about absurdism is that even though it's like a nihilistic kind of or an existential concept that sort of denies the possibility of attaining meaning, and yet it is like striving and like revolting against that. So I would say that it's absurdism actually holds a sort of secret optimism, because it's like secretly saying a part of you does believe that there is meaning, because otherwise you would not be revolting. So I'm on to you, Camus.